Hello there, kia ora. Welcome to this week's Omnibus edition, where you can catch up on all the videos I've put out during the week in one handy, long-form, really depressing video, because I'm sure that's how a lot of us feel at the moment after watching everything that happens in the news. There's only a few episodes this week because stuff happened on the weekend that made Monday difficult to deal with, and I'm taking the weekend off for family reasons. So enjoy what's here. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, make a comment. I don't know, but on the whole, maybe go out and enjoy the weekend where you can, because this stuff can get depressing after a while, and it's not always great for the mental health to be sitting there doom scrolling through YouTube. Hello there, kia ora. I woke up yesterday morning to a bunch of text messages about this. Because of course, Joe Biden deciding not to run for re-election is the kind of thing people message me about, going, you talk politics, you must know what's going to happen next. And the honest answer is, no. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen next. The American system is big and complicated and confusing, and this just adds to it. You see, the technical thing that's most likely to happen is Kamala Harris stepping up and taking over that position. But it's not guaranteed. At the moment, there is no guaranteed Democratic candidate for that particular role. So anything could actually happen. I mean, chances are it'll be Kamala Harris that gets it for a number of reasons. Not just the fact that she's vice president or that Biden has endorsed her, but because there's a whole bunch of mechanical things happening in the background that are really much, much easier if she's the one who takes over. Like the money that gets donated to the Biden-Harris campaign. If Harris's name is still on that ticket, that makes it much easier to ensure that that money is then used by whatever the next campaign is without any kind of legal issues cropping up. Or the votes that are cast in primaries. See, the primary system is a bit strange. Essentially, it's votes from members of the party in each state so they can work out who they're going to nominate at their big convention. The Republicans had their convention last week, and that's where Donald Trump actually accepted the nomination to run for president. And the Republicans tanked Grindr, but that's a completely different thing. The party of ultra-conservatives. Yeah, right. Anyway, the convention, though, for the Democratic Party isn't until August, so there is no actual official nominee guaranteed to take over. There's nothing stopping other people standing up going, I want the job. But there are rules in place about how those primary votes can be redistributed if there is an issue with the person who was running. It's really complicated and a whole bunch of sort of legal stuff going on there. But then there's also issues like what they call Ohio problem. Ohio state legislation actually needs to have those nominations in place and locked down 90 days before the election, which is before both the Republican and Democratic conventions where they accept the nomination. So that process is already out the window a little bit, and Ohio has a really staunch MAGA Republican as their governor, which means that there's not likely to be a huge amount of change that allows things to go ahead in the way that it should if it was a really super smooth transition. There's also issues around how you actually set up and run a campaign. The Biden-Harris campaign is already up and running. They've got that infrastructure in place in terms of the people, the skills, and the messaging that they want to get out of there. And Harris could run on both the wins and awful failures of the Biden administration because she is part of it. Could, if that's what the voters want, but it's really hard to know what the voters want because they haven't had a chance to have their say in the primaries because that's not what they were expecting to be put on offer. So you see, like, there is a whole bunch of confusing elements that come into play, but it is a lot smoother if Harris is still on the ticket. When it comes to a vice presidential pick, who knows who that'll be? Usually there's a bit of a vetting process that parties go through before they accept a certain nomination. But the Democratic Party rules also state that in something like this, the party itself could choose who it wants to have as the VP pick. So they could be really consistent and say, yeah, we want this one individual, or they could be really diverse and there's no real straightforward answer. It could get really complicated. And you can almost guarantee that there'll be a whole bunch of Republicans kicking up legal fights over changes from the presumptuous nominee of Biden to the presumptuous nominee of Harris. Most of them probably wouldn't hold up because they haven't accepted the nomination yet, but there's a lot of complicated stuff that comes into play. And then it sort of also takes away a little bit from the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign and its mouthpieces in places like Newsmax or Fox News have lost the ability to use arguments around the president's cognitive abilities, or age, or Hunter Biden's laptop, for example. So there's a lot of power in taking on a nominee who has already got a bit of experience, already known into the voting public, but can't be attacked on the same things that the opposition side has already set up to start running campaign attacks on. But ultimately, we just don't know what's going to happen next. There could be a bunch of Democrats that are like, no, this is my chance. And there could be a whole bunch of Democrats that come together and go, you know what? Let's keep this as simple as possible. Let's keep Harris as the nominee. Because even though the election itself is technically in November, the earliest ballots for early voting go out at the end of September. You're looking at essentially an 8-week campaign for people to get out there and get in front of those voters, which is not long at all by any stretch of the imagination. And that takes a lot of money, a lot of effort, and having a name that's already attached to a system that's already in place, that does make that transition a lot smoother. But again, when it comes to the future, either way, it's certainly going to be a very different election race to what it was looking like 6 months ago. Hello there, kia ora. On Saturday, I was woken up with a worried call from my sister. Our mum was being taken to hospital in an ambulance with a suspected heart attack. Thankfully, it turned out to be a lung infection. She was seen, tested and discharged with orders for bed rest and antibiotics within 5 hours. She was discharged because there were no beds available for anything short of high-level emergencies. Because like most of our healthcare system, they're running over capacity and under-resourced. And that's because of decisions this government has made. And their announcement this week that Te Whatu Ora is overspending because Labour bad simply don't ring true. You see, our healthcare system is the single largest organisation the government has, and clearly one of the most critical. And the actions of this government specifically is increasing the pressure put on an already under-stressed part of our system. When they're first elected, they decided to reverse the amalgamation that was in place and get rid of the Māori Health Authority. These two changes were in the process of happening when they stopped them, requiring more administration work while they demanded less administration people to fund their tax cuts. Now, all the research shows health outcomes in this country for Māori are worse than for non-Māori, and that setting up the Māori Health Authority was actually the best way to start reversing those trends. They didn't give it a chance to do that. On top of that, they made changes to primary healthcare providers not meeting the requested increase in co-payments to cover the increased costs for those providers, which means those providers had to increase their fees to cover their operation costs. And their decision to reverse the prescription fee subsidy means another added cost for people who are already struggling with a cost of living crisis. And the outcomes from all of these decisions means an increase in the number of people who end up in the emergency room. It gets so bad sometimes that hospitals have been known, just this week in fact, to put out notices like this asking people to stay away unless it's an actual emergency, which isn't always easy to tell when you're in pain and need help. So we have overcrowded hospitals, our overcrowded emergency rooms, people unable to seek medical care before their problems get worse, and unable to treat themselves with medication because of the increased costs. We also have staff shortages on the front line, and while we've been told those hiring freezes to pay for those tax cuts won't apply to frontline staff, that's not necessarily what the reports are saying, and there's added pressure to back office staff, which are also integral to the complicated systems needed to run our healthcare system, especially since the nationwide amalgamation was put on ice. And changes to the ability of frontline staff to work overtime or pick up extra shifts was reduced on top of a constricted hiring philosophy being in place. Oh, and all that before we even start looking at the numbers. The government claims that we're looking at an overspend of about $1.4 billion, or half the money that they gave to tax cuts for landlords. But the reality is this government has delivered its budget with an increase in funding that's lower than the cost of inflation, which means in real terms, Te Whatu Ora has less money to do what they need to do. And they warned the government in select committee hearings about this before that budget was released, that this was going to happen. But the government chose to base their budget numbers on outdated data from the year before they instigated all their changes, which saw an increase in costs, a decrease in primary service use, added pressure to the entire healthcare sector, and these people being able to access medical care when they need it, or before it becomes something that they can't avoid. So when Dr. Shane Reti gets up and starts claiming Te Whatu Ora are overspending and the board need to be replaced by a commissioner, it should be pointed out, is known within the Aotearoa medical fraternity for his narrow focus on top-down economics, unpopularity within the field, and a focus on running private healthcare providers and trying to run public health systems like private health providers, and claims that Te Whatu Ora are overspending. What he's actually saying is they're really underfunded. It's our fault, and the way we fix it is to bring in someone who will slash costs in the name of productivity, not look at how to make the system more fit for purpose for the growing, changing needs of Aotearoa and New Zealand in 2024 and beyond. Which makes it even more impressive when I know that Mum was in and out of one of the busiest hospitals in the country in just 5 hours. Knowing the pressure the staff and the organisation are under, which is being exacerbated by a government determined to make everyone and every outcome some sort of dehumanised KPI. Hello there, kia ora. Parliament is back sitting after, I guess it's their equivalent of the school holidays for our elected officials, and it means we get another chance to see just how chaotic this government actually is, as well as some of their supporters. You see, yesterday we saw a bill dropped from the House because the government didn't have anyone willing to speak to its introduction. The bill itself is actually pretty inconsequential. It started under the last government. It ties up a few loose ends around things like social security and closes loopholes in outdated laws. It's not exactly exciting stuff, but it is bread and butter stuff for running the country. But the minister in charge of this, Louise Upston, was in another meeting. She didn't allocate a proxy of any kind, and Melissa Lee, who technically could have spoken to it, didn't. So it was dropped from proceedings, making the government look completely unprepared to fulfill its most basic functions. Oh, and then the day before that, the Deputy Prime Minister actually used a slur in the House that he aimed at Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngarewa-Packer. It's a slur that's used against disabled people that recently saw Hamilton City Councillor Andrew Bidder make headlines, and of course, all of the MPs across the coalition were really critical of Winston for using this slur. No, of course they weren't. They actually laughed along with him for using it. Keeping it really classy there, aren't they? Oh, the final report into the abuse in state care was also tabled, and the Prime Minister's announced that he'll be offering a formal apology on behalf of the Crown, which is the right thing to do. While this week he was out there celebrating the opening of the First Offenders Boot Camp for Kids, a boot camp like the ones mentioned multiple times in that report that led to a range of abuse towards young people who were in state care. Stats NZ released our latest emissions tracking data yesterday, and it shows our national greenhouse gas emissions have increased for the first time in 5 years. This is just days after the government's much-lauded climate action plan, which will see us no longer reach our emissions targets for 2035 and 2050, also putting at risk a whole bunch of free trade agreements that we've got across Europe and the rest of the world. Yay! In fact, climate scientists pointed out that other than saying that they'll supercharge alternate power supply methods in a plan that the government hasn't actually released, more than a dozen of their points within this plan are going to increase the emissions output for the country. And while the government starts telling people to prepare for the wonderful days of tax cuts, which less than 3,000 people across the entire country will get the full benefit of, retailers in some of our most high-end, busy areas of the country are saying that the current economic climate is worse than the global financial crisis and COVID lockdowns when nobody could go shopping because the economy is being tanked. Oh, our rightist, right-wing mainstream media outlets are celebrating the Prime Minister's decision to stop press gallery interviews on the tiles outside the House, after criticising Jacinda Ardern for refusing to speak to one of them in her tenure as Prime Minister, and they can't seem to see how that looks hypocritical at all. In Invercargill, residents were really unsurprised to find out that a code of conduct complaint against Mayor Nobby Clark for his use of the N-word and homophobic slurs on TV was upheld, but were a bit disappointed to discover that Simeon Brown had decided to throw out the report that suggested stronger accountability measures for local elected representatives. So chances are his punishment will be to say sorry and not to do it again until the next time, which is still coming up because he's already been investigated for when the next time happened. Oh, and you may have noticed that the ACT Party is starting to really ramp up its rhetoric around race and what it considers equality. And that's because the Treaty Principles Bill is expected to be tabled this week. And Mr. 8% wants everyone to know it's not racist. It just strips away rights and protections guaranteed to tangata whenua under the founding document of this country, and makes it easy to justify refusing to work towards equitable outcomes for everyone and strip and sell off natural assets currently protected because that document, how it's seen and been interpreted and enacted by experts for decades. Coincidentally, if you're busy being really angry about the way that ACT keeps race baiting, you're far less likely to be asking questions like, why was David Seymour Snapchatting 14-year-olds? Or why did past party president Tim Yago suddenly resign, and what's he been up to lately? Look, all of this reminds me of a Douglas Adams quote. Human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experience of others are also remarkable in their apparent disinclination to do so. And this government seems to really personify that. Hello there, kia ora. You made it to the end of the week! Today I'm going to keep it pretty short. My parents are actually in town visiting for the next few days, and if you saw my video earlier in the week about the under pressure healthcare system, you'll understand why it's more important that I spend more time with them than sitting in my office making videos for the internet. We're actually off to the food show, so I'm hoping that they have a whole bunch of free samples there. But don't worry, I'll make sure you're covered if you really want stuff. If you're one of those people that tunes in to learn about the depressing things that the government's doing, well, in the past few days, they've started softening the public up for asset sales. Yep, a tried and tested method of revenue gathering when your right-wing government completely tanks the economy and you end up borrowing more than you expected and you have to find a way to justify it all. Kiwi Bank is the first to get the softening treatment. So, yeah, something to look forward to there. Oh, Te Whatu Ora has announced that it's going to have further cuts within its organisation which are going to directly impact the disabled community and Māori health outcomes. And yesterday the government announced new trains and better services for the lower North Island that Labour actually announced last year. Oh, and if you've missed any of the other depressing videos that I've done this week, there is a special Omnibus edition of it that goes up onto YouTube on Sunday, which you can watch. But honestly, I'd suggest that maybe avoid it if you actually want to enjoy your weekend. Oh, and if you want something to read, this week's newsletter is out, and it's later today for paid subscribers, tomorrow for everybody else, where I take a look at the drivers that people have that make them susceptible to disinformation. Whether it's like crazy big news stories like assassination attempts or dead presidents, or smaller stuff like boot camps are tough on crime. And some tips in there as well on how you can help people who are more susceptible to politically themed disinformation. So look, until Monday, try and enjoy your weekend, wrap up warm to avoid the polar blast, and maybe spend some time with friends and whānau. Hey, thanks for watching this week's Omnibus edition. There'll be another one next week. There's a couple of previous editions there now as well if you want to go and check those out. But like I said at the beginning of this, if you manage to make it all the way through, I hope that your weekend is nowhere near as depressing as the content that has preceded this particular little clip that I'm doing right now. Until later, guys, make sure you go out, enjoy some time with friends and whānau, and I will catch you all later.